Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about immigration and cartels. Big question for today is the following: is American intervention in Latin America renewed or is it imminent? We will be looking at immigration policy based on the US, specifically based on Trump's rhetoric, and we will be seeing separately, but also in an interrelated fashion, his actions against cartels in order to answer the question. And you will see in a separate video sometime in the near future as to why that might be. This has been ticking at my head for a few months now, but nonetheless, I will get into a bit of what the next video will be about. Um, but yeah, let's start by discussing the politics of immigration and cartels. So where do we even begin, right? Let's talk about the militaristic or cartel aspect of this video. So at the beginning of the year when Trump assumed office again, Trump militarized parts of the border, specific areas of El Paso and other parts of Texas, as well as some strip of land in New Mexico. If I'm not mistaken, it was all of it, but I could be wrong. The reason for that is because of the fact that he labeled immigration in the southern border as an emergency situation, as an invasion, which would constitutionally allow him to militarize aspects of the border and immigration. However, he has also gone a step further, and he has chosen to designate 8 Latin American cartels as FTOs, or foreign terror organizations. 6 of them have been Mexican. There was Tren de Agua, which we would talk about later, and there was another one, but I'm forgetting off the top of my head. Designating cartels as FTOs allows the use of military capacities and extra legal methods of detaining quote unquote migrant threats. So it explains why Trump has been technically able to deport migrants towards extra legal facilities like that of Guantanamo Bay because emergency powers grant him that. But of course, that's under false pretenses. And in addition to this, under his directive, the ODNI and the DIA 2025 threat assessments labeled the southern border as the USA's biggest threat, which further demonstrates Trump's weaponization of immigration politics. If you're unaware, the ODNI and DIA are both basically the intelligence community of the US, and it is the executive branch, so the president, Trump, that almost labels the threats in an order, right? So if you look at the snippets that were introduced in the table of contents, non-state actors, right, as you see there, foreign FTOs and cartels were labeled as a primary threat. And again, you see that by the DIA report putting the U.S. homeland and southern border as the biggest threat, above China and Russia, which is insane to think about. Because if you look at the threat assessment from last year, under Biden, it was China that was labeled the biggest threat. With that said, um, Trump has also been able to link cartel activities to illicit Chinese supply chains, which includes the trafficking of drugs like fentanyl, uh, to mask that as a big concern for the US based on both threat assessments. In addition to that, there has been an increased surveillance of Mexican cartels by US Mexican operations. It's not really discussed about a lot, but the US and Mexico have been collaborating on drone surveillance or cartel activity. The US is basically giving Mexico assistance, and Mexico decides what to do with the information. There's not a whole lot said because Mexico likes to keep their assessments secret, somewhat secret. So I will scour for that as requested or as necessary. And it's not just the southern border and 8 specific cartel members that have been designated as FTOs that show Trump's how do I put this, weaponization of basically the immigration system. He has been increasing resource funding for El Salvador, which is also controversial as El Salvador is believed to be making a lot of human rights violations with their mass incarceration of upwards of 85 or 88,000 people without due process, which is something that Trump is able to do by labeling FTOs as such, cartels as FTOs, and being able to basically deport whoever the intelligence community may assess to be even tangentially linked to these FTOs. On a separate note, we will now be talking about Trump's specific immigration policies, and I will link both of them in a second, but just bear with me. Let's start off with the fact that it is unclear as to how many immigrants have been deported throughout this year. ICE numbers put it at 40 to 50K in total so far under this specific Trump term. However, there have been claims by the border czar, which I personally disbelieve they wouldn't be possible, that somewhere between 100 to 200,000 immigrants have been detained and or deported, which again, I don't see how that would be possible. However, if the ICE numbers are true, let's assume they are, ICE has not deported as many people as Biden or Obama's terms, with daily averages based on the numbers being less than 600. However, there have been a lot of excuses that the Republican Party has been throwing out. They've been pointing to the fact that apparently ICE lacked resources, but that wouldn't make sense, and I will talk about that in a minute. But to resolve that excuse, Trump's BBB Act authorized $150 billion to ICE, almost half of which went to the border wall itself, and then the other half going specifically to ICE, which, on a tangential note, makes ICE have more funding than all but two other countries combined. To all but two other countries in terms of defense spending. Uh, if I'm not mistaken, ICE even outspends Russia in its defense spending, if you're excluding its nuclear maintenance, which is still insane. Anyways, to these acts that Trump has been doing, as a lot of his deportations have been high profile and have been very notable in terms of their aggressiveness or inhumane means of puffing migrants and sending them on ships to places like Colombia, for example, or again Cuba. Uh, Mass protests have taken place in LA and in Houston, for instance. The biggest one that we've seen was in LA. And it shows that even if the numbers are low under Trump, he's not afraid to use high profile tactics and theatrics to make the point clear that he is trying to deport as many people as he can. And the resource allocation to ICE in terms of spending will realize a lot of latent capabilities for later administrations under Republicans or Democrats, but Democrats are less likely to be this pursuant of deportations in terms of rhetoric, right? This narrative that Trump is posing against immigrants is alarming. Um, Needless to say, right? The whole media has been picking up on it. However, his use of labeling immigration as an invasion and therefore being able to gain more influence and authority on the matter allows him to bypass a lot of constitutional restrictions that a president otherwise faces and stuff like that. And it would well, it would give Trump a lot more capacity to do as he wishes regarding immigration from a legal standpoint, even if flimsy, and from a resource standpoint. Um, but as I just mentioned, and the fact that there are protests and the fact that there are a lot of news covering Trump on a daily basis demonstrate that Trump's anti-immigration rhetoric is at odds with everyone, right? Whether that's within his own party, with people like Musk, whether it's with, say, farmers or business sectors that require immigrant labor to outcompete with legal labor uh, to, gain a bigger profit margin, as well as basic human rights groups, demographic groups, specifically among Hispanics in these areas that are Houston, California, and Florida, which happen to receive among the biggest, if not the biggest, immigrant populations in the U.S. And the fact that Trump is able to use threat assessments, like that, as we mentioned, of the ODNI and the DIA, allows Trump to have plausible deniability with his actions regarding cartels, and therefore it allows him to extend those concerns over to that of immigration. His actions, as I just discussed, are believed to be that of overreach and anti democratic in nature. Anytime that a president, usually in history, right, uses emergency powers, it's usually to backslide democracy. There's a notable example that comes to mind. I'm not going to mention it. But even if you disagree with that um, analogy, there are a lot of other countries across Africa and Asia whose presidents have abused constitutional authority by labeling everything an emergency power. There has been his infamous threats of military use against immigrants and protesters in California, which everyone reprimanded him on, as you don't usually send the Marines out for Americans on American soil unless, if say, there's an invasive party or someone's at war with the U.S. and somehow there's troops in LA, but that's not the case. And as I just mentioned, Trump's rather low, flimsy immigrant numbers so far in deportations are blamed because of resources. However, as I just slipped in earlier, Biden and Obama didn't have to provide $150 billion in funding to ICE to have more daily averages than Trump did. So it demonstrates that Trump, for whatever reason one may impose on it, if it really is a matter of resource allocations, that already fails based on the facts that we mentioned and covered. If maybe it is because he is afraid that he might lose popularity much more than what he already has throughout several events, like that of the Epstein files, his very dangerous maneuver against Iran, and his universal tariffs, uh, may show that Trump is just trying to ride in on the cocktails of cocktails, I forget what they're called, of the news, or the expression, sorry, so that Trump is able to facilitate some form of headline that involves him, as he typically dominates and becomes more slightly more popular once he's on the news. It's something that has been statistically proven based on the last elections. Um, but it is concerning that there has been increased military activity against immigrants, and his anti-immigration rhetoric may actually be a theatric to conduct military operations across the Western Hemisphere. But we will touch upon that more in a minute. So now let's get into the current events, right? We kind of broadly analyze what's been going on for the last 8 months. Now we need to look at what's been happening in the last few days, actually, to tie everything together to make the argument more compelling. It's not what I'm trying to tell you all. So I believe it was yesterday or 2 days ago that Trump put a $50 million bounty on the Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, right? Which would be a first to my knowledge. I don't think any Western Hemispheric leader has had a bounty on him. Maybe Castro and Guevara, but a 21st century equivalent is unheard of to my knowledge. And that's because he has labeled FTOs, the cartels as FTOs, and he has repeatedly mentioned that Tren de Agua, which is a Venezuelan-based cartel that has been legitimized by the Maduro regime, right, by the government of Venezuela, to conduct operations inside of the U.S. through sleeper cells. And there have been quite a few reports of Tren de Agua members being in San Antonio, if I'm not mistaken, and other parts of the U.S. The degree to which the Venezuelan gang link to the government is true, I am unsure of. But there are a lot of other excuses Trump can throw in tandem with that. Excuse me, in tandem with that to further antagonize Venezuela. Below here, you see a picture of some members being caught. If I'm not mistaken, that's in El Salvador. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. However, that's not where it ends. At Shaibom of Mexico, apparently has had to reaffirm Mexican sovereignty because Trump seems to be insinuating some Mexican Venezuelan link. And that becomes a lot more complicated because no, Mexico does not have any strong links to Venezuelan gangs, but Mexico is a transit hub for cartel activity. So there might have been a few interactions between cartel members, but there has been nothing to an obvious degree that might make, say, like a super cartel or an alliance of cartels between Venezuela and Mexico to be noticeable. Um, and Trump does seem to be insinuating a lot of unilateral action against Mexican cartels, which has always been a sensitive topic for the federal government of Mexico, as historically speaking, they have always seen American influence on domestic Mexican matters to be a breach of sovereignty. At the same time, Mexican cartels have become a big threat economically, in a humanitarian aspect, and in a militaristic sense, as cartel members have been increasing in access to modern technology like that of drones. And if, say, cartel member wanted to hit a strong hit strong American critical infrastructure, El Paso, if I'm not mistaken, is within 5 to 6 miles of the Mexican border. And even if a cartel member may not be interested in that, some other state actor may impose a false flag upon the U.S. and trying to determine who is to blame for a hypothetical action like that does warrant some national security concerns for the U.S. But again, doing in a unilateral manner like that of Trump's other operations against other countries, like that of Syria in 2018, like that of Iran last year and in 2020. Uh, sorry, I meant to say Iran this year, not last year. Show that Trump is willing to do things on his own, and that historical grievance Mexico has across constant American intervention, covertly or overtly, in Mexican affairs, is a highly touchy area for Mexico, and really any other country for that matter. And to back up that claim, if you believe that I'm crazy, Republican debates on unilateral action against Mexico go back for years. As you can see at the bottom right corner, you see the dates at which these news magazines were published. And there's been an alarming trend of Republican rhetoric, specifically in Texas, that seems to support American direct intervention of boots on the ground in Mexico. And that warrants its own different discussion. But it shows that the rhetoric against cartel operations have been increasing alongside anti-immigration rhetoric. Uh, Not necessarily directly related between the issues of Venezuela, Mexico, and the U.S., but Bukele, president of El Salvador, has been able to successfully convince the Supreme Court to eliminate presidential term limits, which would hypothetically allow Bukele to run indefinitely. This is after a few months ago, if I'm not mistaken, um, Bukele was capable, or it was a few years ago. I might be foggy with my timelines. Bukele was the first Salvadoran president to be able to constitutionally hold a second term in the modern age. Typically, you only have one presidential term in El Salvador, and Bukele's erosion, you could say, of the Supreme Court has allowed him to circumvent uh, judicial and legislative influence in El Salvador, which, from a historical standpoint, as we have been discussing with Mexico, has been a sign for has been an obvious sign that America has intervened to some degree in Central American affairs. Uh, Bukele would be a textbook example of a quote unquote hyper president, and that can be discussed upon more. I have a few papers written on El Salvadoran hyper presidentialism and Mexican affairs. I will link them on YouTube in the bio if you do wish to read them. Not really going to get into that, but it does show that El Salvador has become an increasingly important country for the U.S. in deportations and in anti-cartel activity. And having a pawn basically as Bukele in El Salvador, who is popular based on his anti-cartel rhetoric and actions, gives Trump a big green light to do a lot of other things that we may not be accounting for regarding cartels and deportations and the basically the outsourcing of the U.S. Carceral system. Based on these current events, if we go back to the question I was asking, how likely is an American intervention in Latin America? Or is it renewed? Is American intervention in Latin America renewed? The honest answer is that the foundations for hard power action are there, right? American actions in Cuba and Venezuela, El Salvador, and increased surveillance across Mexico shows that Trump is definitely willing to go through extra legal means of carrying out deportations and ensuring that cartel influence stays away from the U.S. while having the cover of saying that this is an actual, not just even a national security threat for the U.S., but an hemispheric concern, and that runs at odds with the sovereignty of Mexico, El Salvador, technically Venezuela, Colombia, based on prior actions this year, and extra legal uh, controversy within America's system of deporting quote unquote migrant threats, as there have been a lot of people who have been wrongly convicted or wrongly associated with cartel activity, and because there's no due process of law under FTO labels, Trump is able to get away with it without having to face legal repercussions on the matter. And this not just becomes a question of renewed American intervention in Latin America, but the classic question of whether or not of what should be prioritized, liberty or that of national security. And it looks like Democrats are a lot more or anti-Trump, pro-immigrant, anti-direct interventionists seem to all agree that in cases like this, civilian liberty is to be prioritized over what Republicans feel should be national security concerns. And with that said, it shows that Trump has been successfully able to marry anti-immigration policy with anti-cartel activities. And if that is the case, then it will make it a lot more complicated for policy analysts, for legislators, and for really anyone who wants to enact change on either side of the spectrum to properly address the nuance within immigration itself and within an approach to cartel activity in itself. And it requires a multifaceted set of solutions that I feel the U.S. cannot fix on its own, even if it does so unilaterally. With that said, drone capacities have been enabled by the U.S., which is a first. Uh, Extra legal detainment is possible, as it has been talked about. And with that said, Trump's actions against Venezuela probably are only going to continue to increase, as he already did follow through with stripping Venezuelan refugees of their citizenship status. If I'm not mistaken, that was overturned, but nonetheless, it shows how far Trump is willing to go up against Venezuela. Mexico and the US are probably likely to keep clashing heads on this, and this will probably intensify as, keep in mind, we're only 8 months into Trump's presidency. We still have 3 years and a season to go. And if JD Vance gets elected president, that would be another 4 years. And debates concerning immigration and cartels probably only continue to increase over time. With that said, you shouldn't expect American troops to be in the Americas anytime soon, as technically speaking, there rarely were ever. What you probably should be expecting is a lot more propaganda campaigns over alliances or funding, again, like that of the cooperation between the US and El Salvador. Much more blatant actions like that of deportations into Cuba and against Colombia. And there will probably be much more expanded threats against other Central American states. And should anything major happen at the border, then that will probably give Trump what he needs to enact or fulfill much more of the policies that he had set out to do across these years. So I hope that was informative. It was a mix of current events, policy analysis, and looking at the broad trends of everything. And I hope that you all came out of this video concern with a different perspective. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you for watching.